Good morning. Feeling a lot better than I was last Sunday. I had to sit down. I was really grateful for Braden and Nicole. But I'd like to sing for y'all this morning. God, I'm running for your heart. I'm running for your heart. Till I am a soul on fire. Lord, I'm longing for your ways. I'm waiting for the day when I am a soul on fire. Till I am a soul on fire. God, I'm running for your heart. I'm running for your heart. Till I am a soul on fire. Lord, I'm longing for your ways. I'm waiting for the day when I am a soul on fire. Lord, restore the joy I have. I have wandered, bring me back. In this darkness, lead me through until all I see is you. God, I'm running for your heart. I'm running for your heart. Till I am a soul on fire. Lord, I'm longing for your ways. I'm waiting for the day when I am a soul on fire. Till I am a soul on fire. Lord, let me burn for you again. Lord, let me return to you again. Lord, let me burn for you again. Lord, let me return to you again. God, I'm running for your heart. I'm running for your heart. Till I am a soul on fire. Till I am a soul on fire. Till I am a soul on fire.
Welcome to the Grove. There I am. Good to see you this morning. It was so lovely to greet many of you walking in the door and getting to see some faces this morning that I love to get to see. So we want to say welcome. We're so happy to have you with us today. We are looking forward to our kickoff of a new series. We're going to be starting the new series today. And so we kind of wrapped up last week with talking about stories that Jesus told, walking through some of the parables. And so we are starting today, we're kicking off a series about mental health and spirituality. And so we are looking forward to our conversation today, and I think it's going to be something that you'll really enjoy as well. I want to invite you to stand, if that's available to you and if you feel comfortable. Liz is going to take her beautiful voice and lead us into a time of worshiping together, just collectively with our voices. Whether you love to sing or you just wanted to listen, maybe take in the words, and maybe make this a time of prayer, we would invite you to do that. Whatever. Oh, I got cut off. Oh, I'm back. I didn't say anything wrong. Goodness. But we're looking forward to this conversation again, and Liz is going to take the opportunity to kind of guide us into that. I want to read a prayer as we start this time, and it's called About the Light. It's always been about the light with you, hasn't it, Jesus? Magi braving the distance and the desert to find you, and bewildered shepherds compelled by an angel's invitation allowed light to be their very guide. And it is still the light that calls us to you, the light of beauty that whispers its truth in surprising ways and in places, the light of compassion that kneels and washes roadside, soiled, life-battered feet, the light of joy that glows even in the darkness of grief and suffering, the light that seeks to shine within each of us and through us into the dark corners of our world. It's always been about the light with you, Jesus, and it's always been about the light for us. Please lead us now and always out of darkness and into your marvelous light. Amen. Will you worship with us?
This place is trying to break my belief. My faith is bigger than all I can see. What I need is redemption. What I need is for you to put me back on my feet. Oh, 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 oh. I swear I'm trying to give everything, but I feel I'm falling. Oh, make me believe. What I need is resurrection. What I need is for you to put me back on my feet. Oh, 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 oh. If I could feel you shine your perpetual light, maybe I could crawl out of this tonight. If I could feel you shine, oh, let me feel you shine. So beautiful and warm, so beautiful and bright, like the sun coming out of a rainy sky. Let me feel you shine, oh, let me feel you shine. I lift a knife to the thing I love most, begging you come so I can have hope. What I need is you to touch me. What I need is for you to be the thing that I need. Oh, 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 oh. If I could feel you shine your perpetual light, maybe I could crawl out of this tonight. If I could feel you shine, oh, let me feel you shine. So beautiful and warm, so beautiful and bright, like the sun coming out of a rainy sky. Let me feel you shine, oh, let me feel you shine. God, I need a Savior. Oh, come, generous King. God, I need a Savior to come rescue me. If I could feel you shine your magnificent light, maybe I could crawl out of this tonight. If I could feel you shine, oh, let me feel you shine. So beautiful and warm, so beautiful and bright, like the sun coming out of a rainy sky. Let me feel you shine, oh, let me feel you shine. just how beautiful you are and how great your affections are for me. Oh, how he loves us so. Oh, how he loves us. How he loves us so. He is jealous for me, loves like a hurricane. I am a tree bending beneath the weight of his wind and mercy. And all of a sudden I am unaware of these afflictions eclipsed by glory. I realize just how beautiful you are and how great your affections are for me. And oh, how he loves us so. Oh, how he loves us. How he loves us so. And oh, how he loves us so. Oh, how he loves us. How he loves us so. Yeah, he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves. Yeah, he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves. We are his portion. He is our prize. Drawn to redemption by the grace in his eyes. Grace is an ocean we're all sinking. So heaven meets earth like an unforeseen kiss, and my heart turns violently inside of my chest. I don't have time to maintain these regrets when I think about the way that he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves. Yeah, he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves. Come out of sadness from wherever you've been. Come broken hearted and let rescue begin. come find your mercy. Oh, sinner, come near. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can't hear. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can't hear. So lay down your burdens, lay down your shame. No, I'm broken. Lift up your face. Oh, wanderer, come home. You're not too far. So lay down your hurt, lay down your heart. Come as you are. There's hope for the hopeless and all those who stray. Come sit at the table, come taste the grace. There's rest for the weary, rest that endures. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can cure. So lay down your burdens, lay down your shame. No, I'm broken. Lift up your face. No, I'm welcome home. You're not too far. So lay down your hurt, lay down your heart. Come as you are. Come as you are. Fall in his arms. Come as you are. There's hope for the morning. Oh, sinner, be still. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can't hear. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can't hear. So lay down your burdens, lay down your shame. No, I'm broken. Lift up your face. Oh, wanderer, come home. You're not too far. So lay down your hurt, lay down your heart. Come as you are. Come as you are. Come as you are.
Well, good morning once again. We're going to kind of just jump into what the plan is for this next series. Jody mentioned it earlier. We're going to be talking about mental health and the intersection between faith and spirituality and church. Many of you got the email this week. I want to kind of repeat what was said in the email. Here at the Grove Church, we want to emphasize the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. We believe you matter, the whole you, including recognizing that mental health, good or bad, is a part of the human experience. We believe that everyone deserves compassion, empathy, understanding, and support in their journey toward mental well-being. Our approach here at the Grove is holistic, encompassing not only the spiritual dimension, but also the physical, emotional, and social aspects of life. Mental health is seen as an integral part of this holistic approach. And we want everyone to seek balance and harmony and shalom, which is peace in all areas of their lives. But I think if we were honest today, the church hasn't always been a place where we could be real or authentic. And talk about what's really going on behind the scenes, the things that we are dealing with or struggling with in our lives. I've never been a part of a church where they've spent time, especially a 4-week series, talking about mental health and mental well-being. Because for some reason, with that comes this stigma. And the definition of stigma, I want to read. This was from the Reverend John Swinton. It's going to be behind me. But this is what he says about stigma. It's one of the most destructive aspects of living with unconventional mental health experiences, and one of the most painful experiences that people have to endure. Stigma occurs when a person is reduced from being a whole to being a mere part, from being a full human being to being the sum of a single part. And we've kind of walked through, as our journey here of the Grove, different stigmas that we've faced growing up in church and in fundamental evangelicalism, and this is just one of those things that we want to continue to talk about and push back on. So next week, I'm going to talk about whether or not church is even safe or a good place for us to be. Is it church healthy for any of us? What are the healthy and unhealthy benefits of being a part of a community, especially a faith community? And that will be next week. Following that day, that evening, we'll be at the Yard. We're holding an event. September 10th is World Suicide Prevention Awareness Day. And we're going to be at the Yard from 5 to 7. And we're going to hold an event very similar to what we did last September, where it's a place where you can come and experience different stations. Liz will be there sharing a little bit of her story and some of her music. And we're going to be able to just kind of work through some of those things and bringing about awareness when it comes to suicide prevention. Many of us have experienced and have been affected by that, and we want to continue to bring awareness to that and be a part of that healing and resources that we can provide for you and for those that you love in this community. And so we're inviting you to come that afternoon. It's going to be 5 to 7 at the Yard. In 2 weeks, Matt will be back here. I'll be out of town, and Matt will be in my place, and he's going to be sharing about mental health and some practices for mental and spiritual well-being. And then Jody's going to wrap up the series discussing how we can care for one another, how we can build a supportive and inclusive community. But today, we have a very special guest joining us in the discussion to talk about what it might look like to be mentally well and when we are not. Her name is Sharon Quackenbush, and she's going to be here just up here in a moment. But our goals for this series, and I want to be clear in the front, these are what our goals are to reduce the stigma associated with mental health and mental illness. That those of us that maybe we have a harder time with staying mentally well, or we struggle with different things, we want to know and want you to know that we see you, that you're not alone, that we stand with you, that this is a place where you can share your stories with others, and that we believe fully that there is healing within our community. And I want to also be clear that when we say mental health, we're talking about the human experience that we all face, right? And this includes each one of us, just as if we were talking about spiritual health or physical health or emotional health. And I want to give you an example of this. How many know what I mean when I say this is spider season? Like, I said that last night to someone at the Yard, and they're like, "You guys hunt spiders down here?" I'm like, "No, that's not what I mean. I mean, when I go outside every morning now to let the dog out, I go through about 7 spider webs on the way to the backyard. Does anyone else experience this anywhere? It is the worst, like, right? You know, and I know it's there. Like, I remember sometimes I put brooms by the door, so I gotta open my door, just check to see if it's right there. Our basement door of the church, Debbie, I don't know how many spider webs you probably walk through. Every day there's a new web at that basement door. You can't see it until it's too late, right? We all experience this, and there's an anxiety that comes with our interaction, like with spiders, right? Like I'm reminded of every morning that, and anxiety and fear, those are natural responses as a human. But I think there's like a spectrum of like spider anxiety, right? I think for some of us at one end, it can ignore it. You know, we can just kind of push it away and keep moving along with spiders in our space. We're okay, we can go. But then there's some of us who might want to like just put a cup over it. Like the other day, Jody comes in the bedroom at like 10:30, and she's like, "There's a spider in the kids' room. They won't go back in there." I'm like, what would you do with it? So I put a cup over it. So I had to go and do the magic trick where you slide the paper underneath the cup and carry it outside. That thing was huge, and it had things all over its fangs. It was mad. But then some of us, might just use a broom to kind of push it away or catch it on a broom and walk it outside. Some of us burn down the house. Some of you just don't want to burn it all down, right? Or you won't go in the garage again. And then the far end of the spectrum might be you don't leave the home. Like it's so like consuming to you that you never leave space because you don't want to run into a spider anywhere, right? But that's like this spectrum of it. We all face anxiety, and how we respond to it differs from one person to the other. We may have the ones that it's fine, it's no big deal, to the ones that are burning down houses and never going outside. So this is what I'll do real quick. We're going to take just a brief moment to do a little bit of table talk here. I want you to share with your neighbor where you land on that spectrum of spider anxiety. Like, where are you at? Which end of you are? And some of you remember in Easter and Halloween, we'll hide the Reese's eggs and underneath the chairs, the Reese's peanut butter pumpkins. Well, this morning I put a jar of spiders loose here, so you might reach underneath your chair and find one this morning. But take a minute. I'm just kidding. That would be horrible, right? Take a minute and share with those around you where are you at on the anxiety spectrum of spiders. All right, I hope you had a moment to share. How many burn the house downs that we have? Do we have quite a few of those? You guys burn the house downs, right? So this is my friend Sharon. Sharon and Tom are up from Florida. So that's one of the great things about Florida. There's not many things, but this is one of the great things is Tom and Sharon coming up here. We met Tom and Sharon. Can you guess where we met Tom and Sharon at? Wild Goose. Look at that. I meet all my friends at Wild Goose. Tom and Sharon, we did meet a little bit. We don't have much of a memory of it, but we were at Southeastern at the same time. Tom and I were. I don't know if you were there at that time or not. But we met again at Wild Goose. It was 2016, that summer. They brought Matt up to the Goose, and I met all of them there, and we hung out and camped together. And then Matt, just a few months later, ended up coming here and living here. And so that we're all connected through that. And so Matt was very jealous that you guys are here with us today, and he's not here with you. So that's what he gets. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna lean into Sharon here. We had a conversation Thursday afternoon. I was like, hey, I want to reach out to you. Like last week, I called her and said, let's set up a time where we can reach and talk. I want to, throw some things at you and get your opinion on some stuff. And so we had about an hour conversation here on the phone. And I was like, tons of great stuff. And I'm like, man, I wish you were here. You could share this with us. And she was going to be up in October, headed this way. And I said, well, maybe we'll just have you come and then we'll flash back to September. And she's like, well, actually, this weekend we're headed to Tennessee. And we could come through a day early and spend Sunday morning with you. I'm like, done. And so we quick booked a hotel room for them, and we have Tom and Sharon here with us. And so on the screen behind me is going to be a cell phone number, just a random cell phone number, and you can text your questions in. If you have any questions that come to mind or questions you want answered or responded to, we'll try to get them to them today. If not, we'll maybe later be able to get those to you. But if you could send messages to that cell phone number there, and if those questions go with where we're at, we'll throw them out today. I'm trying to fit them in. But I have a handful of questions that we went through already together, and so she was prepared for this. And so I'm gonna just ask, and she's gonna just bestow her wisdom on all of us. So. First, let me hear a little bit about who you are, your experience with church, and then with mental health. What's that been like?
Well, first, can I say just a few things about
you may say whatever
just being in this space? So my first thing is I realized I am a spider adopter, which probably says a lot about how I deal with anxiety. I adopt it as a pet, and I cherish it, and I hold on to it. But I just wanted to say that being in this space, it's been a while since I've been in a church. And we had to identify that this was the first time I've been in a church in a while that felt like a true sanctuary. So there's something tender about being in this space that is just really meaningful. So thank you all for providing that. So my name is Sharon Quackenbush, and I live in Florida. I knew Matt because we also went to the church that Matt was at as well for a while in Florida. But I am the daughter of a Methodist pastor. I grew up in a very small rural town in Florida. It kind of reminds me a little bit of Bryson City, but it's a little smaller than Bryson City. So this feels very familiar but very different in some ways. So grew up in the church, and I worked as a teacher for a while, and then I worked in youth ministry, and I kind of dabbled from one to the other, because when I was teaching, I realized I can't love the kids in the way I wanted to. And so I felt like youth ministry would give me the opportunity to share God's love to kids. And then when I got into youth ministry, I ended up working at a church. If anybody's following the Methodist Church right now, it's going through a bit of a split and a very difficult time over LGBTQ things. And so I was working to kind of build a safe youth group for young people. And that was going pretty well, but it was also a very difficult journey. And I realized how many of my young people, how many of the youth in my group were dealing with suicidality concerns and mental health concerns. And I realized just praying through it is not feeling like enough to me. So I went back to school and I went to get my counseling license so that I could also help people on the mental health end of things. So that's been kind of my journey through these transitions through youth ministry to the world of mental health. But that's what brings me here today.
So mental health is kind of vague. Just, I guess, the term mental health, and really it's something you shared with me the other day was it's really just, it's health. It's that's what we're talking about. Behind me is going to be the definition of mental health according to WHO. That's the World Health Organization. I'm going to put that up there for you. And this is, it's not verbatim word for word their definition. This was kind of from one of the books that I got that kind of like paraphrased a little bit. But let me read this to you. It's actually I have it in front of me so I can. Mental health is more than just the absence of mental disorders or disabilities. Mental health is a state of well-being in which an individual realizes their own abilities to maintain healthy relationships, cope with normal stresses of life, work productively, and contribute positively to their community. Mental health is fundamental to our individual and collective ability as humans to think, emote, interact with each other, earn a living, and enjoy life. And so that was like the World Health Organization, kind of how they framed it. For you, when I say mental health, or when you hear that, like how do you define it? What comes to mind when you hear mental health?
So I mean, it was funny because when you asked me that the first time, I was like, oh, just look up the WHO definition. But for me, mental health is what we defined earlier. It is mental, so it's focusing on the mind. So the ways that we think, but the ways that we also absorb information, the ways that we process that information and senses around us, and then also the ways that we respond or behave. So kind of our actions and reactions beyond that. And so that's the mental factor of it. And then the health factor is, it's kind of interesting because health is a hard thing in my eyes to describe, but I feel like it's a spectrum of conditions. So we can identify that we either have a healthy experience, and that's usually defined as good or wellness, or we can have an illness. And so that could be a physical or a social or an emotional or a mental component. And so I feel like that breakdown of the word mental being the mind and then health being the spectrum of our ability to be either healthy or unhealthy, which is ill or well. And we all kind of fall into that spectrum.
All right, so we are in a faith community. We're in a church. The intersection of those two. Why is it important, or is it important for faith communities to address mental well-being or mental health? How important is it for a faith community to talk about that?
I think it's very important if you want to connect with people in general, because I feel like everyone right now is dealing with something, and I don't want to automatically just blasé say that everyone is dealing with a mental health challenge. But prior to COVID, a third of the US population had anxiety. I feel like stigma is a global concern. I was telling my husband on the way up here that, I don't know, my office is a therapy office, so I'm kind of biased to assuming that people who walk in are at least getting over the stigma of mental health, or they've reached a point where they have to come in. But I think that globally, we are still learning so much about the ways that our brains and emotions work. It's new science, it's relatively new science. I was doing some research on the way up here and found out that We're still doing electric shock therapy for individuals with autism. That is still happening today. We're still doing conversion therapy. That's still legal in some places. And so America, but also globally, we just have not progressed to recognize what is actually healthy. And so there's a lot of stigma still attached to mental health. And I think some of the main reasons we have a fear of mental health is because, one, it's unknown. It's an invisible situation. You can't look at a person typically and know what their mental health status is. But also, we all have a fear. If we have a fear that, oh my goodness, if I'm broken, will somebody ostracize me? Will somebody reject me? Will somebody hurt me? Will somebody disregard me? Or will somebody judge me? If we have that fear, that really triggers a very deep part of ourselves of not belonging. And that not belonging ties into our core belief of, if we don't belong, we are in danger. Because if we think back on our ancestors, if you got kicked out of the village, you might not make it. And so I think that really creates a fear for us. And then we also have a lot of bias because we have experiences. Jody, you were talking about the pain and suffering that's kind of happening in this community, but if you think about whatever your experiences might be, what you've seen or what you've experienced kind of comes to the table about how we view mental health. So a parent whose child starts to exhibit some mental illness may feel very guilty or very ashamed about that. Or if you have a family member or a friend who has experienced or completed suicide, that can bring up a world of emotions for us. And so I think that we stigmatize because we're afraid of what we don't understand. We're afraid of what we don't know, and we're afraid of what we can't fix, essentially.
So, keeping with that theme of being in church and with the stigma, where has the church gotten it wrong? Like, where in your experience have we pointed back to, blamed it on, whatever? Like, where have we traditionally, in evangelicalism or just Christianity in a whole, gotten it wrong?
So I laugh because as a therapist, I'm usually asking the questions, and I was like, oh, that's a leading question. I want to ask you that actually as a pastor. I feel like it depends, which is a very typical clinician response. It depends because every church is different. I don't want to generalize or overgeneralize churches, but I do feel like a lot of churches get it wrong in the messages that they teach or in the ways that they diminish emotions. There are a lot of churches that focus purely on the joy and the excitement and the good feelings. We have kind of this misnomer of what feelings are good and which feelings are bad. And I think we really highlight that in some churches. You know, the joy of the Lord is my strength and all these other concepts. And so as I was sitting there and listening to the songs today, I was like, wow, these songs are actually addressing human suffering. These songs are addressing some of those feelings that we often diminish. So I wouldn't say this church is not recognizing that, at least in the time that I've been here. But some churches really do acknowledge only the good emotions as being holy. I think that there are a lot of what we call cognitive beliefs and cognitive distortions that happen. Binary thinking is a big one. The belief that we only have a body or a soul, and if one of those is broken, then that's a sign of a lack of faith. And so I feel like sometimes we think when we are thinking poorly or when we are emoting poorly, that is a sign that we have a faith issue. But that does not mean that. That means that we are struggling because that's part of the human experience. I think some of the key concepts of some faith traditions of our brokenness, our sinfulness, really just sets the groundwork for a ton of shame over us as a holistic being. And you said that earlier, you were talking about how we're a whole. Mental health really focuses on integrating our entire system. So mental health, when I work with mental health, sometimes I'm teaching people drink water today, that would be helpful for you. Sometimes I'm working on very deep treatment for schizophrenic concerns. And so it could be anywhere on the range of maybe you just need more sleep, maybe you need some medication, maybe you need something, maybe you need to think about the way that you're thinking and reevaluate that, or maybe you need to just be able to tame your emotions and recognize if you say what you're feeling, it's gonna feel better. And so I realized that just across the board, I think the church really causes us to separate ourselves into these finite and nice little groups, and then oftentimes forces us through shame or through embarrassment to hide sections of ourselves, and that can be very unhealthy.
I think many people still ask the question, well, then where does it come from? One of the ways I feel like the church has gotten it wrong is we've always pointed back to the garden and said, well, because of the fall of man, everyone since then is broken and sinful inside. And that's something we've spoken pretty strong out against here about where we stand with original blessing, this idea that we were all created in the image of God, and that we aren't created broken, we aren't created sinful in that way. But there's stories within our ancient text that we always point back to when we talk about mental health or mental illness, and we point to these stories of people being what looked like possessed or things like that in scripture, and we're like, oh, there it is, and it's because of sin or it's because of that. And I think we've done a horrible job at it because we're trying to diagnose Old Testament or New Testament people with today's measuring sticks. And so if I still ask that question, well, where and why? Like, why are some of us predisposed to handling things in different ways than others? Like, well, is there an origin? Is it where did it come from?
So why are you scared of spiders? Is what you're asking me.
Why would I be scared of a spider? So.
Why does Jody put them under a cup? Yes. Well, that's a big question. That's a big question to ask. I'm not really sure. I'd have to dig into your past a little bit to understand that. But so we typically use in the newer forms of mental health work, we go by, it's a fancy term, but it's biopsychosocial model. And it's this belief that we have both a biological component of our mental health, we have a psychological component of our mental health, and we have a social component. And so it's kind of an extension beyond that nature versus nurture concept. There are a lot of things that we're finding are based in our nature, based in the wiring of our brains, based in the wiring of our bodies. There are some diagnoses that honestly, if your parents had it, you have a much higher rate of likelihood of having that. Things like ADHD, things like bipolar disorder, those are often hereditary. Not all the time, but sometimes they can be hereditary. So sometimes that is genetic. There's some studies determining whether or not autism is also hereditary. So some of those things it's in our biological makeup, similar to diabetes and some of these things that we might be prone to. We can't always help what genetics we get, so that's part of it. Mental health also has a psychological component which focuses more on the ways that we think, the ways that our body processes information. So some people are much more aware and sensing of the world around them, more sensitive to sounds, more sensitive to light, and that's not something that they can help either. And some people process information differently. So like with ADHD I mentioned earlier, we just kind of process information in a different way. So some of those things are things that we cannot control. We cannot change how our body processes dopamine or processes serotonin or processes some of these chemicals. And so those are two major components that we have to acknowledge. We're all kind of on a different spectrum of neurodiversity, and we have to recognize that component. But then also, I think the social aspect is the one that I really tend to key in on, because it's the one that we can sometimes change, and so that feels good to feel like we can change that about ourselves. So the social aspect includes your social systems, your social upbringing, your factors of resilience is a term that we call it. So what has kind of helped you to overcome some of the adverse experiences you've had? If you've ever worked with a therapist or you've ever kind of just done research on your own, you might come across a term called ACEs, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences. And we're finding more and more that the amount of times that you have an adverse childhood experience under the age of 18, you're more likely to have health outcomes that are more negative as you go on. And those can be things like your family has a divorce, or you have abuse in the family, or there's drug use in your family. So those all can actually have other health outcomes as well. And those are things that are part of your social environment. I think things like racism, oppression, all of that too really kind of plays into it. So somebody can have either the biological part, the psychological part, or the social part, or a combination of all of that. And that's kind of what contributes to the mental health.
So where do you see the God piece of this? Like, where does the faith piece intersect with this? Because there's people without faith communities, maybe that don't even believe, that deal with this, and then you have this part of it where the spiritual piece comes into play. So where do you see the intersection for you, or for those that are in a faith community, integrating the two of those? They're dealing with their mental health as well as in a Christian context.
Yeah, and feel free to have follow-up questions if this doesn't make sense. So it's funny because when I went to grad school, when I went back to school, I was kind of adamant that I was actually going to be a person who did research on religious trauma. And I did a research paper where my goal for the research paper was to basically deconstruct how faith is dangerous and how having a faith background is actually more harmful to our mental health. And I got very frustrated. I remember talking to my grad school professor because I was adamant that church is bad for people. We can find the research on that, we can see that. And I kept coming up with research that was no, actually it's not. It can be very, very beneficial for people. It can be very beneficial to the mental health. Having a purpose, having a community, all of those key factors of a healthy church, and I'll quantify that, a healthy church can be very, very, very helpful to our mental health and mental well-being. But I was certain I was going to find research to describe the latter, and I did. I mean, it's out there because there's a lot of trauma and there's a lot of pain, both big T trauma, so physical experiences that people have had, but little t trauma too, those incessant little messages that we get that kind of cause us to feel like our world doesn't make sense anymore, cause us to doubt, cause us to hurt. And so I feel like integrating faith and mental health is incredibly important because faith is a huge component to our well-being. We're whole beings that have so much more than just our body and our brain and our heart and our gut. And so there's something greater to us, and so I think faith is a big part of that. Yeah,
I read a lot this week. I'm going to share more about it next week. Vanderbilt did a study where it wasn't just a church, a mosque, a temple, other communities that are people that are a part of those live longer. They have healthier hearts, they have healthier ways that they handle stress and anxiety, which again, is there should have been something negative in there, but it seemed like it was really positive for people to be a part of a faith community, because actually there are health benefits to it, and so we'll share more.
To be honest, the research annoyed me. I was like, I just really want to just rip this apart and let's start fresh, but I could not fight the research that faith really does make a difference in the lives of people.
Yeah, I'm sure we could probably research reasons we see therapists and find plenty of church-going people that.
Yes, there's a lot of it.
So how can then a faith community such as this be a part of the healing process? And healing, and we've talked about this before at the church, that healing and curing aren't the same thing. There's the healing that comes within being a part. One of the things that Jesus did masterfully, beautifully with people is he healed them into community. When, for instance, when he healed the leper, it wasn't just the fact that he took away the disease, which we find now was, and obviously science has taught us that it's a chemical, it's a gene, it's an enzyme that's in our body that does this. It's not sin, what we would have thought in Bible times, someone has sinned in this guy's life. But he healed the people back into community, restored them back into that. And so how can a church be supportive in being a healing community for some?
I think a key step is recognizing this is not a choice, recognizing that there may be behaviors that are frustrating that come with mental health concerns, but that doesn't mean that the person is actively choosing this for their lives. I have to say, I feel like you're doing a really great job here, because just the sense of sanctuary, the sense of tenderness in this space, that's a big thing. I say always anchor in love and always anchor in curiosity. The fact that you're doing this sermon series, I think, is very valuable for that, in helping just kind of shape and re-understand some of those things that we might have misconceptions about. Talking about things can make things very much out in the open. I think it was Brene Brown who said that shame will die if it's in the light, but it thrives in secrecy. And so this concept that if we put it out there and just say, y'all, we're struggling, or hey, I'm struggling, that can be a very powerful healing environment. Now, I say that with a caveat, because I always, there is a part of me that's always cautious with churches. I say that with a caveat because I say, consider it like you would consider any other kind of health. So if I walked in and I had, this is a little gory, so trigger warning a little bit about wounds, but if I had a big gash in my leg and I was actively bleeding and I was like, I'm fine, I'm gonna help fix somebody else's wound right now. I'm actively bleeding, I'm making a mess everywhere. I might also possibly bleed on the people around that I'm trying to help. And so I do have a caveat about helping. When a church has reached a point where there's a safe environment for people, what happens sometimes is those of us who are helpers in care can be actively bleeding with our own emotional wounds, our own emotional health illnesses and struggles, and we can accidentally bleed on other people. And so what I always say to people is try to make sure that you are putting on the oxygen mask for yourself first before you help other people. Try to make sure that your wounds are at least scabbed over, and so that your preaching or your messages or your talking and your healing is coming from a scar but not an open wound. And I think that that's really important, because when we are trying to work together in a triage situation, sometimes life does cause us to be in triage crisis situations. But when we're working in those situations, there's a major possibility of cross-contamination. There's a major possibility of vicarious trauma being passed around. And so I find sometimes what I've seen churches not do well is small group activities where they just start sharing trauma and sharing trauma and sharing trauma, and nobody there is healed really enough to help. And so everybody just becomes very traumatized by those situations. And so I think churches really need to recognize, as a collective, we need to create an intentional safe space. But as individuals within a church, it is your responsibility to also be getting the help that you need to work towards healing. I say that realizing that when I came from a small town, mental health is a privilege. I realize that mental health care is a privilege. I don't know how many therapists you have in your area, so I don't know if it's really easy for somebody to just go, hey, I have a therapist locally. I know in my town we didn't have one for at least 40 minutes away, maybe not even that. And so there are things that you can do to be working on mindfulness and be working towards wellness. I find if you work on the wellness factor, the mental illness factor can reduce. There are some factors of mental illness that do need professional help. Like if you walked in and you had a broken leg, I wouldn't recommend that your friend just reset your broken leg for you. Or if you walked in and you had a broken car, maybe your friend knows some things about cars, but maybe you should take it to a mechanic. So some of those more severe concerns do need professional help, but there can be things that you do here, just the breathing that you had us do, Jody, at the beginning, just being in a space where you're honest and vulnerable can really all play a huge role in wellness.
We talk about being vulnerable here, but kind of two pieces to speak to, and you were doing that just in the last few things you said, but what's the risk of a church when we say healing? What people might hear, Jesus can fix it then, and then that's all I need is more faith. Your lack of faith is why you're feeling these ways. That, and also maybe just a warning or, telling people that not everyone deserves or has earned the right to hear your story. You need to find safe people. And so when we say this is a safe place to share on your time, and it doesn't mean that you need to be on stage and telling everyone your story, but only to those that have actually earned the right to you to hear your story. So maybe speak to those real quick, what's the risk of a church pretending that they have the answers and not sending them somewhere?
Well, I mean, I always say churches should probably refer out on a lot of this. They can talk about it on a way where you're educating, where you're informing, but if somebody is coming in consistently with challenges, it's, like I said, please don't speak from a place where you're actively bleeding. That doesn't mean that I want anyone in the church to feel like you can't talk to your friends, you can't talk to your small group, you can't talk to your pastors. But recognize that it is like an open wound. It is messy, and there are people who can fix it and people who can't fix it. I do think we have, I saw this happen so much with COVID, but just a distrust of medical professionals in general, where people were, refusing vaccinations or things like that, saying God would heal them. And I think it's the same thing. If we keep going back to that health component, there are factors where we have to reach out to somebody else professional. In the simplest way, because I don't expect people to diagnose and be like, oh, you are struggling way too much. You are actively bleeding and I need to send you to the hospital. You might be able to see it in a person, you may not be able to. So the self-check that I usually invite people to do is to consider, okay, is my emotion or is my feeling, does it make sense for the situation that I'm in? Because we can be very distressed. I heard that many of you are going to a funeral after this. It is distressing, it is hard, there's a whole grief journey after you've lost somebody that you go through. And does that make sense for the situation? If it does, great, then you may just be experiencing normal human emotions. If it doesn't make sense, or if it's prolonged for a very long time, then that might be something that's more critical or concerning or need professional care. So that's my first check is, does this emotion make sense for the situation? And then my second check is, do I actually have the coping skills and the resources to help me effectively with this emotion? Because if the answer to that is no, or if you find that you're struggling and dealing with that emotion, then maybe that's a time to find somebody or find those resources that can kind of help and support you. So I hope that makes sense.
One of the things that we're going to provide, and we'll have it a paper copy for everyone, but it'll also be online. A handful of months ago, I reached out to the community in general and just said, hey, if you are in therapy and you love your therapist, or you've been in therapy and you loved your therapist, give me some names and some numbers. And my phone blew up, which was great. I love that the fact that so many people have experienced and are experiencing therapy and things like that. But we're going to provide that for you guys, for those of you that might be seeking that. There are local and within a drive availability in this area, but there's a lot of ones that are just online that have been very helpful for people, where you don't have to leave your home or drive anywhere, but they're accessible online. And so we'll be providing that for you guys as a resource, as well as some books and different things that you guys can do. I'm going to read this question coming in, and then I want to kind of move to the point where we asked me a little bit of an experience that we could walk through together. I'm just going to read it as it came in. For parts of the church who may be causing trauma, do you think their belief systems have been built from a series of little t traumas, that their own spiritual identities forming out of those constant wounding messages, and that's what they know to pass on? And so here's the original question where that came from, and I'm going to
pick over the question.
I wonder if the churchgoers who may believe differently are acting out of those little t trauma events repeatedly and over a lifetime, so much so that they can't see the ripple effects to others. Does it take a big T trauma to open their eyes?
Yeah, and just to kind of clarify that big T trauma and little T trauma, if that's not familiar, I know I kind of alluded to it earlier. Big T trauma, so trauma in general, I'm going to go back to basics. Trauma in general is actually, when we define trauma, we're defining the event, not the response. So a traumatic event is a thing that happens to a person. The response is kind of what we experience from that. Or no, sorry, I have that backwards. So we have an event, but the trauma is how we respond to a thing. So similar to a spider, somebody might actually be traumatized by finding their spider under their chair at church. And some people might not have that. We actually will have people who have both been in the same car accident, and one gets PTSD and one's fine. And so it's not necessarily the event itself that creates how we respond to it. It's kind of our biological, psychological, and social wiring that causes us to respond differently to bad events. But there are events that can be traumatizing and are more likely traumatizing. I hope that was clear. That felt a little unclear. So essentially the person is asking, is it little t traumas or big T traumas that kind of cause the church challenge? Is that what you were getting from that question? So we have a good friend that we're actually going to be seeing on this trip. We're seeing a lot of really cool people on this trip, who identifies their little t trauma as they were attached to a fundamental church, and it felt like they were given an IV of poison their whole lives. So it was these tiny little insidious moments, these little messages that you're not enough, these little messages that you should be ashamed of who you are, that they got throughout their childhood that actually caused them to feel like they have what is complex trauma. So complex PTSD is also another diagnosis that we can give to people, but we can also just have a complex experience with trauma. Big T traumas, I think, those big events, things like what has happened a lot in the Catholic Church with priests and small children, those are big T traumas that make the news because they're an event that people can say, that happened, that is not okay. I think both are very, very dangerous. I think sometimes it's harder to unpack the little t traumas than it is to unpack the big T traumas, because those big T traumas are a single event or a single moment, but those can hugely change your life. But it's all different. It really depends on how we respond to those experiences. I find churches are usually more likely to do the little t traumas. But I also feel like we see a lot of the big T traumas, and those are the ones that get into the news. There's something else about that question. Do you mind pulling up that question? Because there was another part of it that I wanted to make sure I was hitting. So, for parts of the church who may be causing trauma, do you think their belief systems have been built from a series of little T traumas? Yes, I think a lot of the belief systems that are often what I consider harmful belief systems. And I usually, this is an oversimplification, but I usually feel like if it is a belief system that causes you to be separate, whether you're inside yourself or separate from other people, those us-them concepts, I think those are very dangerous. So that's kind of how I oversimplify what's healthy and not healthy. That in their own spiritual identities forming out of those constant wounding messages, that's what they know to pass on. Yes, and a phrase that I use all the time in my therapy sessions is that hurt people hurt people. When we're hurting and we don't realize it, we tend to be hurtful people to others. And so sometimes what I see just generationally is people who grew up in those not validating emotional churches where those messages are kind of incessant. They inadvertently pass those messages on to their kids and on to generations beyond that. And so it's a lot of generational work that we have to do to unpack that.
One of the things that we've done here, Liz has, when she shares her story, and what we're going to do next Sunday is her theme is "Secrets Keep Us Sick," and that's kind of the idea that you were talking about how we hold these things inside and they continue to make us sick, and we need a place to be able to release.
I feel like you and I are all reading the same books.
I want to kind of give you a chance. I had asked Sharon to maybe lead a group moment exercise or something that maybe we could tangibly experience that might help us, whether we repeat it at home on our own, but something that maybe would maybe spark something inside us to kind of like consider, think about where we are, each one of us are, when it comes to mental well-being.
Okay, so I have a couple of different thoughts. I think what I want to leave you with today is probably one of my favorite tools that I use in therapy all the time. This is a trauma-based therapy tool, so it's helpful in kind of re-regulating our bodies when we are experiencing a trauma or a trauma-like reenactment, where we're kind of feeling like we're back in one of those situations, whether it was just a bad experience, or whether it was a traumatic experience, or whether it was that incessant message that we had growing up that has hurt us. And this helps us to be back in the present moment, and the present is very important. So I feel like a lot of times, again, oversimplification, when we're dealing with anxiety, we're often focusing and fearful of what's to come. And when we're dealing with depression and guilt, it's a lot of like what happened in the past. And a lot of PTSD comes from what happened in the past. And so this helps us to be present in the here and now and kind of establish safety in the here and now. So I'm going to invite you to, and you can do this with the people that you were talking to earlier about spiders if you'd like to. You can kind of share these out loud, or you can do this kind of quietly on your own. But I want you to look around the room, and without judgment, I want you to notice 5 things that you can see. So this is an exercise called the 5 senses. So just look around the room, and you don't have to notice like, oh, I like that or I don't like that, but just noticing what are 5 things that you can see in the room around you. And if you want to share with your partner nearby, you can, or we can move on. So that's 5 things you can see. I want you to notice 4 things that you can feel. So this might be physically feeling the chair underneath your body. It might be feeling the clothes on your skin. It might be feeling the way that your skin is sensing the air around you. It might be something about your mouth, or the way that you are feeling the food that you've had, or the coffee, or maybe something that you're holding. But notice 4 things that you can feel physically around you. And you're welcome to touch and rub. Now I notice we're providing a very quiet space. This one's very hard for some people too, because it's hard to slow down our brains. I want you to notice 3 things that you can hear. And then we're going back down. So 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things that you can taste. So hopefully you've had some of the delicious coffee or tea. Maybe you had a peppermint. Maybe you need to put a peppermint in to have this experience. The 2 things you can taste without judgment. And then the last one is 1 thing that you can smell. And this makes some people uncomfortable or some people nervous, so this is a non-judgmental zone, but 1 thing that you can smell. Okay, and when you're ready, bring it back. So this exercise I love because it allows us to experience our sensations. It allows us to get in touch with our bodies and our brains and our thoughts. And it just kind of integrates all of those parts of us. This is very helpful if you feel like you're getting dysregulated, if you feel like you're feeling an emotion that you don't know if you can really control, or if you don't feel like you can really kind of come back to a space. This is a really good exercise. If you're in a group and you're finding that somebody is saying something that might be triggering for you, this is a good exercise. If you're feeling frightened because now you're worried that there are spiders everywhere, this could be a good exercise to just kind of bring you back to a baseline.
I want you to help me thank Sharon for being a part of our service today.
Thank you for having me. It's been an honor.
We recorded the message, so we'll put it online. Looks like I have to splice 2 of them together. My phone may have stopped recording at some point, and Liz jumped in. Thank you, Liz, for doing that, and so we'll put that together. If you don't mind sticking around just for a few moments, if you want to come up and say hello to Tom and to Sharon, and you may do that, or you got a question for them that you didn't send up here that you want to ask, I'm sure she'll give you a response to that. So again, guys, we want to say thank you. We're excited about this series. Again, I want to invite you back to next week. We're going to talk about, can a church be a safe place? How can we be a healing community, and how can we, what are the health benefits of being a part of a faith community in general? So, guys, thank you so much for your. Have a great week, and we'll see you next weekend.